Hi, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, an exceptional speaker today, Dr. Konrad Kording. Dr. Kording is visiting us from the University of Pennsylvania, where he holds a prestigious Penn Integrates Knowledge position with joint appointments in neurobiology and the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. Konrad founded NeuroMatch, an initiative that is making high-level education and conferences freely available to thousands of students across more than 100 countries, and of the community of rigor, which promotes scientific integrity and reproducibility. Dr. Konrad Kording's lab seeks to understand the brain as a computational device, developing innovative approaches that allow neuroscientists to mine neural data for causal relations. As he often says, his research has one single focus: data that matters. So please welcome Dr. Konrad Kording.
Okay, I have a coffee. What else would I need? Thanks so much for being here. It's a talk that I haven't given often. So if I miss out on anything, if anything's unclear, please interrupt me. Wait. I love being interrupted. It's a talk about modeling attention, and it started for me right in the beginning. This was the first systems neuroscience paper that I was ever exposed to. I was a young undergraduate. I was invited to this meeting, and back then, binding by synchrony was a thing. And now, like, you're probably binding by synchrony. What is that? The idea on what is binding, the idea is the following. When you see me, there's millions of neurons in your brain active, somehow in relation to me. And the idea of binding by synchrony is if there's such a distributed representation, there must be something that tells all those neurons that they belong together. And as is the case when people hypothesize that the brain has a problem, they hypothesize potential solutions to that. The potential solution that this set of papers, this is from a review paper by Wolf Singer, which I should have cited on here. The idea that this paper put forward is, let's assume that all the neurons that are part of Konrad somehow synchronize with one another. They spike at the same milliseconds. And then maybe comes the neurons that have something to do with his talk and the blackboard and like everyone else in the room. And then eventually Konrad will come back as a synchronous firing of all those. So what this did is it profoundly influenced my career as a scientist. My PhD thesis was asking if the brain actually does it like this. I never published it. That has multiple reasons. The first thing is I just failed miserably as an experimentalist. Put electrodes into cat brains and couldn't spike sort it, and kind of like the whole set of failures that you can have as an experimentalist. The other one is that me and everyone else in the lab basically gave up on this way of thinking about how the brain does binding. But this idea that there is the binding problem comes from us. The idea that we need something that says these things belong together and these things don't. And I think that is computationally truly important. Like in our deep learning systems, transformers, we have this attention mechanism. What do we want to talk with one another? Well, we kind of really strongly want to have pieces of the same object talk with one another. And we only want pieces of different objects to kind of like, yeah, they might give a little bit of a context. But basically, this arm of mine tells you a lot of information about this one, whereas this arm of mine tells you preciously little about Kanaka's arm. Like maybe a little bit of context, but it's going to be very limited. So this is what I wanted to figure out. How does the brain solve the mind problem? And in the end, I get carried away with other things. I made my way despite failing at my proposed PhD project. And but somehow this idea that I want to figure out how the brain could be doing binding always stayed with me. And today's talk is kind of our modern take on that same idea of how could the brain know which things belong together, because we feel it's important. So let's first talk about what I want a model to have. Like a model of binding, a model of object-based attention. No, actually, I wanted to briefly point this out. you can view this as binding. You can view this as object-based attention. It's the same thing. If I have a way of making the lady kind of be active now, and then the cat be active now, and I go back to the lady being active, that's also a way of like binding. No? Object-based attention is a way of binding. So what are our criteria for success? So my key criterion from the time when I was a PhD student was that I want things to work in real-world stimuli. In fact, when I did experiments on cat, I showed them natural videos, and I used blue screen, green screen technologies to like put like running mice into those. And it was entirely impossible to analyze the data because it was poorly designed. But like what I did back then is I attached a backpack with a camera to a cat. The cat was running through the forest and I was running after the cat. Because back then a VCR was like a big, expensive, or like a big, heavy device, needed to have an inverter and a car battery and all that. Today, your phone has all of that like much better, and you can, the phone today, the smallest phones are less heavy than just the camera was back then. But in any case, we get like real world stimuli. So I want a mechanism or a theory for how the brain does binding. I want that theory to actually work in the real world. And that's what we wanted to build in the project that I'll talk about today. So let's talk about what we know cognitively about attention. Now, there's lots of established frameworks in that area. There's spatial attention. Now, I can tell you, look, tell me which number is where I first show you the dot. I can be like, look there, what's going to be there? That's number 3. That's spatial attention. There's pop-out. I show you lots of things. One of them is different, and boom, like O of 1. You can tell me what that object is. There's search. We can say, where's the 9? And you can look and you can tell me, okay, the 9 is like in the upper right. There's lateral cueing, like tell me what's the thing that the arrow points at. And there's masking that you want to ignore. And of course, object recognition, and so on and so forth. Lots of cognitive phenomena in that area. And there's also very, very well established neuroscience of that. Now, like we have what's called attention-invariant tuning, where you can say, if I have a neuron and I have its tuning curve at a time where it's not attended and a time where that same location is attended, there's a difference, but it looks like the rough tuning for preferred orientations and so forth is going to be the same. If we don't attend something, our acuity is lower. We're also slower at it. And there's like experiments by Rolf Zimmer and many others. I should also mention before I go into my talk, of course, this is not a new set of ideas. Not like the modeling of attention is really old. And the modeling of binding is very old as an idea. No, but like it generally has the property that humans build an attention. Scientists like me or you. And it usually has relatively limited long. There's exceptions, I'll talk about some of them. And usually a narrow set of tasks. They take like one task, train it on it, they use training and see how good things are. I want to mention some historical models of attention. Here's Bruno Olshausen's routing circuit, where you can say we have either like big objects, an A, a big A, or we have small object, a small a, and then somehow we have a routing mechanism that normalizes these things, that takes an object, transforms it into a standardized representation, and then we can commit that object to memory. Should also say, of course, memory is seen as a main output of attention. Like we can't commit unlimited amounts of information to memory at a given point of time. We kind of like are forced to do it like one thing at a time. And again, of course, there's like slight wrinkles to like the overarching ideas. Like there's cases where anything has its violations in a sense. I should also mention prior work by the Sarah lab here. They use recurrent neural networks. They train similarity, and they show a pretty broad range of capabilities, producing nice data sets of what belongs together and so forth. But, and I should also mention UNet as an inspiration. If we look at, like if I want to build networks that actually work, that kind of solve real world tasks, it probably helps me if I look at how the deep learning field solves problems. That is the universal recipe in today's world. If you want to build something that's good, you take something that's good at the most similar task, and then you like optimize it at the boundaries, and we're no exception to that. The unit, classical 2015 classical network used for mask learning and image segmentation. We take an input that we put in. We take then, not like this side here, you can see as a classical feature hierarchy. Layer, 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 downsample, layer, 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 downsample, layer, 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 downsample, layer, 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 and so on and so forth. Now, if you only have that, there's a problem. Not like if you're at this level, you will have lost most of this fine spatial information. It's gone, like because you lose it, you downsample. So the UNet uses these bridge connections here to fill in what is missing because of the downsample. And this will be a big inspiration for us. And you can say, how does the UNet even look similar to a brain? And let me like spell that out. We can say we have an input coming into our system. It goes to a layer that does gating, and we'll get to what gating means. But then it goes to feature map, next gating level, feature map, and then we have recurrent interactions at the end. At the end, it might also have like predicted label, now like this is a cat. And we then, and now is the idea, just like the way a lot of people think about the role of attention in the brain, is that at some level, the information that comes from the top allows us to like select things at the next lower level. We will universally be doing soft selection. The reason why we want to do soft selection is outside of the things you attend, there's still a lot of useful information, both for recognition and for just like knowing how you'd want to segment. So you don't want to throw away that information. You want to retain that information, but you at the same time want to know like, okay, these things are part of the object I'm currently looking at, and these things are not. And yeah, what else to describe here? Now, like then you can say at the lowest level, like our soft attention map might select an object. Here you have a composite image. We use those because we know very easily how things look like. Yes?
Just wondering if there's a budget for attention. Are you trying to share resources, or like is it a soft max, or is it?
It's a soft maxi thing. Now you can say in reality, there are two layers of budgets. Not like there's a layer of budget of how much attention do we put on things, but there's also a budget if I'm in a complex scene like this one, and I want to recognize all of you. It would take me linear time in the number of people that we have. And you can say ultimately, however we build things, we need to give it a budget of how many rounds it has of computing. Well, I should mention there's probably ways of not being, but like in any case, so then in each layer we have what comes from the bottom, we have what comes, and then we have on the left-hand side, and you see here how it matches the UNet while also matching roughly how cortex looks like. We have feature processing here. We have relevant masking information coming down here, and then at each layer, they meet one another. Now, to be clear how it deviates from actual brains, like in brains, people haven't clearly characterized that there are some subset of neurons that do kind of like mask-like things, although I'll show you some examples of how they might actually have that without knowing it, versus that do feature-like. So in that sense, it's slightly out of the domain of what we currently believe. But otherwise, not like everywhere in cortex that you have a forward projection, pretty much everywhere. You also have backward connections. And even if they're not direct, you might have it like through multiple layers. Good. That's our architecture. And I should also say, not like there's in this architecture, we can do the many standard things. We can do classification. We can have attention where we can say how good are we at actually segmenting an object at the bottom. There's the possibility of having partially supervised things, and I'll also show you the various chance levels. Now let's look at how will I train this. Now here you see the architecture. And I should say there's a bunch of layers, of course, of this kind. Just like there's a good number of layers to cortex. We train it with a standard loss function here, where we have a cross entropy loss that basically just says, I want this thing to be good at object recognition. And we have a reconstruction loss, which is, I want it to segment the image in the right way. I should also say, everything I'll show you today is supervised learning. We played extensively with it, and there are ways of replacing significant pieces with unsupervised learning, but that's not the goal for today's talk. Like, I just want to show you we can train a system so that it gives us like the attention mechanisms that we are looking for.
So the loss to the ground truth segmentation.
Yes, the mask thing is ground truth segmentation loss, and the classification loss is ground truth object classifications.
Who does the segmentation?
So we will use two set of stimuli. I'm sure there's a slide coming, but one of them are generated stimuli. Think of like us taking MNIST and building composites of multiple MNIST digits. And then there's the second. So in that sense, we get the mask ground truth by construction. And then we use the COCO data set where the masks come from a lot of not so voluntary people who basically draw lines around objects. A reasonably big data. It's not big by today's standard, COCO, but like by academic neuroscience labs, it's a very big data. Great, and let's also talk about the iterations. No? Like, we ultimately have a recurrent system. Like it goes in, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, it goes recurrent all at the same time, every step. So what we have is we have a fast iteration here, and it matters for our analysis because just like in brains, I want to talk about what happens pre-attention, and then I want to talk about how attention changes things. Now, like I can get pre-attention class logits. I can get and I can, in any case, we can have a fast readout of the attention map. And all the way at the end, we have an attentive class logic, and we have attentive feature maps. And there's multiple time step. And of course, like as always, we are training it with backpropagation through time because we're just interested in making it work. If we were trying to match the learning algorithms in brains, we would be pushing towards unsupervised learning. And we would be pushing towards replacing BPTT with a more biologically realistic algorithm. But we're trying to separate. We're trying to get at good algorithms for attention instead of getting simultaneously at good algorithms for learning. Okay, great. So I will show you lots of anecdotes. And because I show you lots of anecdotes, because I like showing lots of anecdotes, I first want to show you like the data that goes with. So this is the results from MNIST type models where we do object recognition, inhibition of return, perceptual grouping, symbolic oriented, object tracking, pop out, and top down search. The only thing that I really want you to see is that kind of like it does pretty good on all those tasks. It's not perfect. We're not trying to like get SOTA at MNIST. I'm not sure if that even makes sense given that you can like get very far with linear models, and like MNIST is probably the most overfit model that exists in the field. The key is because we'll also do it on COCO, kind of like the fact that MNIST is boring and overfit isn't much of our problem. Yeah. Good. Let's talk about object recognition. No, so we do object recognition in somewhat more complicated Bregman type situations. Here you have a stimulus sequence. We put this complex mask on top of it to make it be not entirely trivial. Object recognition, where we're giving this as input, time varying like a video. We give no prompt. We don't tell it anything specific. Here, as you can see, the output maps that it has, and it ultimately assigns high probability to the 6. Now, I'll also always show you what the training data is in these cases. Oh, hold on, I didn't talk about that when I first talked about the architecture. We use the same network, but we basically just tell it, this is the search task and the number is 7 you're looking for. Or this is the pop-out task. do your thing. We basically just give the prompt all the way at the top of the layer. And I think you can see that here up there. Not like we one hot encode what kind of a task it is. So all in the same task. Good. Object recognition, here we have like the 6. And again, like you saw here, object recognition, of course, it does a pretty good job with attention. At classification, and it's also good for mask. As object recognition, let's talk about the next one, perceptual grouping.
Sorry, I don't know how. Is this just going to be like a bunch of different little glimpses of things, or how much do you care about actually matching the psychophysics of object?
We're not trying to explicitly match the psychophysics of object recognition. We will be doing some matching against electrophysiology at a later point of time in the talk. The key thing is rather that we want to establish that it can do the things that we do. I should have talked about that when I talked about the other models. So like there's a big literature of models of attention, but these models tend to not work in real world scenes. So what we are trying to do is have models that work well in real world scenes.
Yes, I mean that's great. I was just wondering, like, because you mentioned Bregman, right? So like, there are lots of Bregman-like stimuli that like Peterman used, for example, where it wasn't just do they recognize something, but you know, it really mattered whether the non-accidental features were included or not. That kind of thing. Like,
It turns out that I have a little bit on that. Like, why don't you ask me after like a few more examples of this? But yes, there is an opportunity that we didn't take because this paper is like a 100-page tome at this point of time. Of like matching more precisely against like the many aspects of, like for every one of these tasks, there is a wonderful, rich, big literature on like places where things go wrong, like in stimuli that are hard for humans. We could have checked, are they, but that wasn't the goal here. The idea is more like we want one architecture that does all those tasks. And for us, the main thing is like, does these tasks instead of like, matches all the aspects that we know of. That was the goal that we had for this. Now, the problem is in every one of these tasks, there's just such a rich literature. And so if we went all the way in there, this would become very, very unwieldy, very, very quick. Yes?
If something clear what role the recurrence was playing, how do you type number of time steps?
Yeah. The amount of time steps is not like the way we think about attention, is it's a way of improving things. Fast shot, you kind of have all the features in the world. One iteration later, you can kind of select an object. One iteration later, you can select an object based on objects you selected before and things like that. We chose, I believe, 5 or 6. And the reason why we did is it turns out that over that period of time, it kind of generally get where we wanted. Time is interesting here, where you could say if we don't have enough time, then it needs to optimize itself for being more time efficient. We didn't want to push on that. You can say that humans evolutionary and during their life have a pressure to do it faster, but that again wasn't the goal. And then it would be a great follow-up work, to kind of see to which level such systems can learn to kind of like find shortcuts to do things much faster. But for that, we would need to have more complicated tasks. So it's a bit of a bind here. Great, object recognition, perceptual grouping. I'm like, hey, I want to see what's gonna be coming up here. I show you 2 frames of the dot, and then I'm like, tell me what's there. And of course, it learns to do that. It learns to do that very well. It seems to be about as easy as object recognition itself. Here, we pointed that it should choose the lower left. It chooses the lower left, the 5. The mask is identical to the Kempner digit that we have. It says 5 here. Symbolic orienting, like we give an arrow that points in this case to the lower left. And it's learned to basically say, tell me where the arrow points to. And what we see here is that it does tell us where the 1 is. And again, you've seen like the rough quantification. Again, for all these tasks where it has to do like these relatively easy things, it's basically as good as it would be for just object recognition. And of course, later we'll get at some things where like it gets like more mileage out of attention than simply doing logic, which is what most pop out. We show a bunch of zeros with a 9. And of course, we randomly balance across colors and numbers and so forth. You see right in the beginning, now here you see a little of the dynamics of attention. Right in the beginning, it's very diffuse. And then as it keeps going, it like starts homing in on the right digit that we have here, the 9, and detects that as a pop-out task. Good. Top-down search. Here we start giving an input at the top. We're like, give us the number 8. That's what we get at the input. This is the stimulus. It has to now select the 8 out of the different things that are there. And of course, works, like in the sense that now says 8. We can go further. We can do a tracking task. Tracking just means you have the same object, it's moving. You find that object, distinguish it from all the rest. You have the 2, you can see the 2 moves. There's times where it overlaps with lots of other things. But you can see it reliably tracks the 2. It like never like deviates from looking for a 2. And you can see that it correctly gets the mask where the 2 actually is. Inhibition of return, now like yet another task. What we train it here, it has to go recognize an object, then go to the next object, recognize the next object, go to the third object, recognize it, until there's no more objects. And here it says like 4, 4, 5. Of course, it can learn this task. Now we get to the Bregman illusion. Here's at least 2 versions of it. There is the ink blots visible, this kind of a task, where you see the black thing. Can everyone see what the digit is that's behind it? What is it? It's a B, no? Yes, it's a B. And in this case, if you don't see the ink blots, it's a little more difficult. I mean, a lot more difficult. So we use versions of these tasks. You can say it's not exactly the same version. Would be nice to have access to like how exactly they did it there. But here we have like these things on it. Here we have occlusion static, but the occlusion is visible. Occlusion is static and it's invisible. We don't show it. This is the stuff that you don't see. And then we have out of distribution. In all cases here, it does a pretty decent job at getting there. Now, let's go to the real world instead. Like this was all like a little bit like MNEST, like we just wanted to show that our network can in principle do all those things. Let's look at how things look like in the real world. Yeah, so yeah, we take data, COCO data set. I should just like before say that we're getting pretty good results here, or like by our standards, good results of like generally the tasks get like 80, 90% right. In pink, you always see the classification performance. In green, you see the attention performance. Attention is easier than classification because just selecting the right object, you can do that even if you don't really quite know what it is. Good. Real world object recognition. Like here we have a giraffe. And we don't give a prompt. It's trained, ultimately produces the right output map, roughly. Like this is the ground truth. In COCO, keep in mind, we have the ground truth mask. And of course, we have the attention system that our model has. And there it puts out zebra as output, which is wrong, which I think is a mistake in making this slide. This does not look like a zebra. And I haven't seen this before. You just chose that these are new slides. Good. Not a zebra. And then you can say real world perceptual grouping. Again, we're like show dot dot. And then here we have the bear come in. And it segments the bear and also says bear. And of course, it's trained to say bear. Now, like a malicious reading of everything we do here is that all we do is we show that supervised learning is possible. And like we take a neural network, we train it, and guess what? It can do the task that it can do. There's going to be some comparisons with brains, which it can't do otherwise. But for me, given that I thought about how the brain could be doing these things for a long period of time, just seeing it work was wonderful. Yes.
Are these maps cleaner than what you would expect from humans? Like, for example, if you look at athletes, I would expect like some speckles.
This is interesting. I believe Sarah produced the data set where humans kind of looked at, indicated where the relevant is where. I wouldn't be surprised if at some level, at least when it comes to relatively fast phenomena, it would outperform us. I'm not sure though what's a fair comparison. Like kind of like we have like amount of compute. If I push a human on time, they arguably have less compute. I'm not sure how to match these. Yes.
Malicious reading. Maybe there's a slightly less malicious reading, which is about the criticizing end-to-end. Presumably, that visual system is not optimized end-to-end. Probably some part of it is optimized.
Yes, and in that sense, it's not part of this paper or this talk, but you can replace it with the right kind of unsupervised criteria and get some.
But you don't train that on.
For this, everything I'm showing here is supervised trained to get the class labels right and to get the mask, right. And they're both ground truth in both data. Cool. Real world ground truth, real world search, you're like prompted with BERT, and it does and good and the good majority, the vast majority of this get like the BERT. Now, I wanted to say a little more about the malicious reading. Like the malicious reading is at the same time right, but it also, I think, points to something about primitives that we have in deep. Like in deep learning, in standard like vision systems, the primitive that we provide is a multi-layer transformer. That transformer kind of, at least in standard versions, cannot use information from higher layers to do something to the lower layers. Arguably, this set of techniques here allow you to broaden the set of primitives supported by neural networks. Namely, it adds selection, it adds iteration, it adds those things. And it can do all of that with like local information, which might be good if we eventually want to implement. Good, but like in any case, it can do these things. So let's see where it can do interesting things. Here's a data set that absolutely shocked me. This is from Cellup A. There you have a distribution of, we have two copies of the same graphical element for reasons that are a little unclear to me. But this is the Cellup A data set, photographs of celebrities. And here we have the distribution. We have about among female celebrities, we find that about half of them have black hair and about half of them have blonde hair. And among male celebrities, 30% have black hair and 2% have blonde hair. And that came a little bit as a surprise to me. I grew up in Germany. I assumed that most people who are blonde are actually blonde. And so the interpretation of that data set then is that either somehow you're much more likely to become a celebrity if you happen to be blonde, or alternatively, that there's a way of changing black hair into blonde hair or brown hair into blonde hair. I had no idea that people can change the color of their hair. But you can see immediately what we should be expecting to happen in this case. If I now ask a neural network like, hey, here's a photo, is that a man or a woman? What will it do? It will be very much biased to like, if your hair is blonde, probably female. You know, like that's the logic that we should be expecting because we have this massive class imbalance here. And that's what happens. Now, like if you take any like standard neural network and you train on it, it like is very much biased. So, but like we can do the same algorithm that I told you before, We have an input sequence, photographs, attention maps, and then we have the attended features. And guess what? Like once it's trained to solve gender recognition, it very much doesn't look at the hair color. And here's how things look like. We have all classes, not like, and you can see the attention mechanism does much better at that. Why should it be doing much better? Because it will not look at the hair. And for blonde females, no difference. Black-haired, significant difference. So that's why we expect problems. And now, blonde males are very, very, very frequently misclassified. And there's a good amount of misclassification otherwise. Now, why? Because it's just such a strong feature. Yes.
In this example, during training, are you providing like the attention mask only on the face, not?
In this case, I believe we just trained this for recognition.
Okay. I guess I'm just, why does it not attend to the hair?
Because the hair is not a good feature for gender.
Wait, okay. In the data set.
Okay, it's a misleading feature for gender.
Yeah.
And therefore, like masking it out, like basically, there's enough information in a photo to do like first order, to solve this task. If you focus on hair, you will be getting a good number of them wrong. And I don't think people do that. And again, there's undoubtedly a big literature looking at how you use it. Here you can see attention maps. At the top, you have pre-attentive feature maps after the first conv layer, just the first 4 of them. And there you see the attentive feature. You can see that the pre-attentive features focus significantly more on the background, and they focus a lot more on the head. In any case, let's get out of the space where like there's so much malicious reading and like look at some neuroscience data. Let's look at electrophysiology. So this is the paper that ultimately convinced me and a lot of people in the lab that the brain doesn't do binding by synchrony. How did it do so? The paper doesn't contain the word binding by synchrony. But it was a paper by Peter Wolfsinger, who trained with Wolfsinger, and this whole experiment was clearly designed to test if the brain does binding by synchrony. Of course, the Nature paper says nothing about it, but I think we all knew how to read it. So it's an incredibly clever experiment. They have one receptive field here of a neuron, and now they have 2 stimuli. They have a stimulus that looks like this, stimulus that looks like this. The monkey's been trained to do the following thing. Look at the monkey always looks at the fixation point first, and the monkey's task is to look at the dot that is connected to the end of that line. And in this case, that line goes right through the receptive field. In this case, in the receptive field, there's exactly the same content. You still see that line there, but it's not on the line that the monkey needs to attend. Like the monkey here wants to figure out, oh, I should look here with my eyes. And here, the monkey should figure out, I should look there. So the idea is that therefore, in this case, the receptive field is in the attentional spot. And in this case, it's not. Everything else is the same. And on the right-hand side, you see how we then formalized it. The way they designed their tasks seemed, there was no algorithm that came with it. Here's a simple algorithm. We take curves. Otherwise, it does the same thing. We have like these 2 tasks. And we basically just queue with these points, and we basically train it to produce the mask that is on the entire line. And key concepts here. We have a curve of interest. We have the receptive fields. We have stimulus 1, stimulus 2. One of them is the target. Like we give the cues just like they did. One of them is the target. The other one is the distractor. We expect the target to be very active because it's the attended stimulus. And we expect the distractor to not be very active. Okay, and here's how it looks like modeling that task. Here you see the iterations. This is how we prompt it. You can see it like extends the attention along the line. And then at the end, this is what it needs to get right. Here's for Q2. And again, it selects the right other line. And of course, it does it very right because we trained it just on this task. Good. Let's look at some ethos data. So let me start explaining what we have here at the bottom. So here we have the Rolf-Zimmer data. What you see, I mean, like the first thing is like none of the figures showed binding. None of the figures showed synchronization, which clearly they were looking for. What you see is you have these target and distractor cases. The stimulus comes on, it goes up, standard phenomenon of visual cortex. New stimulus produces a big volley of activity, goes up, goes down, and then like later there's a difference where the attended object is more active or like the non-attended object is less active. And you can look at the percentiles of firing rates. Here, target versus distractor. Target is more active than distractor. And here you can see the number of neurons that are significant for the modulation index clearly skewed onto the right-hand side. Now, this is, of course, continuous time. And every millisecond, neural activities change. And of course, we only train our system on a small number of iterations. Why BPTT with 120 steps is really hard. And even if we had it running on 120 time steps, it wouldn't produce, we shouldn't expect it to produce this initial volley, which is a completely different rate. But what we do see is that initially, the responses are the same. They have to be the same, no? Because like the stimulus is the same, and in the feed-forward passes, it is the same. And then as time goes on, there starts to be a difference where the attended stimulus is more active than unattended stimulus. And then at the end, it goes down again. And again, like for responses, you can see it's more active. And the modulation index also has like a more positive. I want to show you, though, that there's like a big spike, big peak here of like medium 0.5-ish modulation index. This is a feature that the neural data does not. Yes?
The actual data, main response is the initial response.
Yes.
The difference is in one way.
Yeah.
We see it in the.
Yeah, and we have nothing of it. And I think the way like you think about that initial thing from a standard neuroscience perspective is that there's a big component of predictive coding where kind of as it comes on, your interpretation of the world changes very much, which leads to the need to produce a lot of spikes. Once that has percolated through the system, it kind of doesn't need to repercolate through the system. And that's why you have that early spike. But again, like I'm sure in computational neuroscience, there's alternative interpretations of it. But yes, this early spike is absolutely not part of what we do. And I think there's relatively few, like none of the neural network models would have that property generally. But if you would build in something like predictive coding, it would immediately give you like an early spike like that. And in fact, it's quite interesting. Like, why is it that a new stimulus leads to this massive, massive volley of spikes that is bigger than anything else before attention comes in? Like attention is more like, must be some recirculation at a later level. Great.
Forget the division of the delayed inhibition.
Yeah, so we don't, we have kind of implicit inhibition in the system in the sense that we have these soft mask layers. So like, but again, like the space of models you could produce in this case is basically arbitrarily large. Again, we were going for the effects of attention that I couldn't explain back then, and that I think the literature is not good at explaining at this point of time. We're not trying to kind of get all the aspects right. And I can already tell you additional things. Like if you use neural networks, the tuning curves in the early layers tend to be too sharp relative to the real ones. Complex cells have different aspect ratios as simple cells that the typical models also don't explain. So there's a long list that any model that we're aware of at this point of time, along which it's deficient relative to reality. And I just like exposing like the weaknesses. So I want to give you like a complete view of like what I feel we can say something about and what we can't say anything about. And I understand I have to wrap up like in 3 minutes or so. Is that right?
So
Okay, then then. Oh, but I'm close to the end anyways. So this is good. And I love questions. So the next thing is attention-invariant orientation tuning. So you have the targets and the distractors. We can do orientation tuning, how we like have just lines of different orientations go through the same area. Here you can see big difference in firing rate, but very similar tuning, very typical for data in brains. Same thing here, very close here, quite similar there. This is of a given neuron. These are, for example, yes, and it should be average firing rate. And yeah, but keep in mind, like it has one here. This is normalized. Arguably, like I can't tell you in an artificial neural network what the activity is in spikes per second. There's an arbitrary number.
But we should run it with your time.
You do have time, yes.
Because based on the last time when what happened.
Oh, so I do believe, let's go back here. I do believe that, oh, we should have marked. I do believe that it takes the average between these 3 times, 2, 3, and 4. So there is some dynamics of how it changes that we're ignoring. Cool. Great. Tuning properties. Now, like we analyze how the neurons change. Let's first again go through the ethos data. So things do change. Like the previous graph was just anecdotal. Here we have amplitude modulation. Like we are fitting these Gaussians, von Mises functions, and we can say how much does the amplitude change. And these are, I believe, McAdams and Monsell are for Boston. Yes. In any case, modulation is the ratio between these two. You see that there's a broad distribution, but on average, the activity is higher in the case where it's attended than if it's unattended. In this case, we have width modulation. How much does it get wider or narrower? I think it's the ratio of the two of them -1. This thing means it gets wider. This thing it's narrower. So there's no systematic bias, but quite a bit of noise on it. Asymptotic modulation, you can move the whole curve up and down. Distribution, and then like shift. Now there's no shift on average. So this is what they call attention-invariant tuning. If it moved sideways, we would view this as activity, as the tuning is changed. And on the top, you see the equivalent things for us. Amplitude modulation, 0.4. Again, we didn't calibrate against it. But clearly, gets more active. Very little influence on width modulation, but quite some variance. Again, why? Like it goes to many layers, and a lot of in the attention mechanisms that we have can in principle do anything. Yeah? Asymptote modulation, non-preferred orientation, just like in physiology. In that sense, it shares the hallmark features of attention-invariant tuning. Yes.
But the amplitude modulation is very different.
Yes. Let's talk about this. So the amplitude modulation, it's positive in both cases. But in our case, it's more like most units are not affected at all, and a lot of neurons that are affected a lot by it. Whereas in biology, it is much more distributed set of activity changes. I think this is generally a phenomenon when you model biology effects, that kind of biology is kind of more smeared out, more diverse, whereas like in most models, like some things have like very clear effect, clearer than biology would ever thought. But this is, yeah, like this is important, and there might be something important hiding behind this. Great, that was the last slide. Take-home message. I think attention should be seen as a necessary part of multitask, or like at least a very useful part of multitask behavior. Why? At some level, giving that extra primitive that we have when we have our input systems, that we can tell them what our task is, so that they can make sure that the information that we need for the task make it through it, and can already get rid of some information that is not task relevant. Such a mechanism should make downstream tasks easier, and because it can reuse much of the hardware there, it should be more efficient. I think it's an example of construction of models through gradient descent. I think we've seen a fair number of them recently. I think it has some properties of cognitive behavior, certainly in the case of the Brackman type stimuli. And I think, so for me, it's like the trial of like taking the models that I got used to in neuroscience and kind of moving them towards the real world. And it's clear that we want to train them like deep learning systems with gradient descent. The question is what we lose with that, because it makes it less interpretable. Like, I don't know the mechanism. I just know like what the architecture is that I built in. But it could like mask very hard. It could mask very softly. It's kind of like it figures out how it wants to do that. It could dedicate whole pieces of its architecture to do something else. It could kind of use it to effectively have more layers of computation. And like if you look at Dino V2, like like there's signs of it like basically using the many layers that it has to like basically add more compute to what it already has. So so it moves it more towards the real world, but at the same time, we lose a lot of interpretability by going to this class of models. It replicates some properties of neuroscience, and it's clear that we move into a future of deep learning powered models, but I think neither us nor like generally the field have yet figured out kind of how to exactly do that. Now, because if you go through the task, I was like, it does this, and it does this, and it also does that. But at the same time, it lost a certain amount of interpretability. I can't explain to you quite how it does that. It can be like, yeah, look, like it kind of does like some soft masking. Like, yes, that's what it does. But I can't quite tell you how it uses it and what it's useful for and why it has exactly the parameters. So in any case with this, I look forward to a discussion.
I always kind of wondered about the extent to which the machine learning thing we call attention is always anything like human cognitive attention. It seems like based on the talk, there are some meaningful similarities. Do you think there's still something qualitatively missing?
So the answer is I don't know. We are currently following up on exactly that idea. Now you can say, do we find mechanisms of human-like attention in artificial systems? And do we find signatures of artificial attention systems in humans? And I think both these directions are really interesting. But I think at this point of time, I mean, like I should mention, there is some work by Sarah where he looks at human-like behaviors in attention in transformer models. And so there are some, I think there's interesting new questions opening.
I thought it's very interesting how you introduced a tool for predictive coding. The result that you displayed the initial like in. I was wondering if you could just say more words about that there's more interactions happening between predictive coding and attention. Because I always thought that predictive coding had a role to play in sort of what thinking.
Okay, that's a brilliant idea, and let's maybe spell that out a little bit. Like, if we have a predictive coding system, then that predictive coding system should be object specific, because like the components of an object should be really good at predicting the future of it in a way that like all other things are not. And in that sense, it's probably true that you could view predictive coding as a as an unsupervised, self-supervised mechanism to drive the learning of that kind of algorithm. In particular, if you had videos of things changing. Now, we would love to train these things with videos, with mechanisms like that. It's just learning from videos as an academic lab is not very fun. And I mean, it's like sad in a way. But at the same time, like with the MNIST-like stimuli, it should be doable.
Right here.
Thank you for the talk. So you showed that you train your model on different tasks and like the model could successfully solve all of them, but it is not trivial to me that if the model solve all of those tasks like similarly, is there any way to just like train them on one task and restore a part of the model and then use that restore, like freeze some ways and then extend it to other tasks or like train them on all different tasks at the same time to see if
yeah, there's lots of versions of that you can play. You can, for example, train it on a couple of tasks and see how much carries over to other tasks. Can you get the extra task by just fine-tuning after training maybe one of you train on two of them, you then fine-tune on all the other tasks. So like there's a lot of versions that you can do of those tasks. Very strong prediction is that that it strongly carries over. No, because why? Because it's like the same objects in all cases. I do believe that the appendix of our manuscript contains such an. I'm not sure about all aspects because I should also have emphasized the person who really did it, Saeed Salehi, he's just amazing. He kind of did so many versions of this. And because the paper is massively long, there are some of these angles that I don't fully recall. But yeah, it's a absolutely great question.
So this seems like a fantastic model of top-down sequential distribution style. But when I look out into the world, finding usually thousands of objects. So to kind of circle back to where we began, do you see this as like a mechanism that's being replicated and accounts for that type of finding as well? Or do you see it as kind of qualitative?
So I want to push back on like the assertion. Like I walk through the world just like you, and everything is bound with one. And I think that's. And how can we know that it's an illusion? There's these cool masking studies. I show you like blue square, red circle, and I do it very quickly. I show them to you, and like then everything gets white. You don't see it. If I do that fast enough, you kind of know there was red, and you know there's blue, you know there's a circle, you know there's a square, but you're not really sure about what went with what. If I remember the literature right, it's rather that storage of conjunctions like that has O of n time requirement. But basically, for every pair that you bind together, you need to dedicate some time. And now when it comes to object-based attention and binding, you can say you could never know the difference of either having bound everything or being able to bind everything really quickly. Like there would be no difference. It's because as long as you can solve that query very quickly, it like for you is as if you always had it bound. I think we live under the illusion that we have all things bound. But in reality, we haven't, and it takes time. And what do I know? Like it might take 100 milliseconds to bind.
Implication that you can only have one object.
I do think that there's psychophysical evidence that that's the case. Now, look, like that's the problem. There's always these edge cases. Like there's these tracking studies where you have like n objects moving through space, and then they move and boom, and then it's over, and then you're being asked about it. There's Weiji Ma has some research that shows that it doesn't, that it looks like you can kind of like have at least a very, very large number of those. But as I ask you for more and more of them, you get to be very noisy at like answering those questions. But first order approximation, I think it's fair to say that you do one object at a time. And there's multiple reasons. So like the first reason is overt attention. I can't really bind you while I look at him because like basically I don't see you. I'm blind instead of so that's a first layer. But I think even if you have displays where you don't move your eyes, there's still this like one object at a time bias. So the model, how it's implemented, there's one convergence to something and then the next convergence to things. Now you could extend those models so that it can converge on multiple things at the same time. And we have some ideas on how one could build that. But this version does one at a time.
Like, I mean, I think the one out at the same time is not that good of a representation of
I can no, and then the question is, what is an object? Now you can say, is it my hand or is all of me an object? There's this kind of a lot of like
fine. There's not a structure in this.
Yeah, that's right. No, and it's an artifact of our training procedure. No? Our training procedure said we want you to attend an object and then the next object. So you could say in a multi-object tracking task, it's like, I don't want to do that. I want to do all of them at the same time.
It's not right?
So it gets committed to the data set, which is like, architecturally, it's not committed to it. Like it can learn any recurrent like self-gating strategy in the end. Now, like it might implicitly be so though, no? Because if you would attend many things at the same time, you would have no mechanism of preventing them from interacting with one. And at least conceptually, and that's our concept, and that might be wrong, but conceptually we are thinking of this as a way of avoiding links that you don't want to have. And for that, it would be a bad thing. But you're right, now, like generally, if we allow arbitrary such things, not all of them will be of the sequential nature. You can say, I want to like get pairs that are far away from one another, that they can kind of like push the system with sufficiently minimal interactions, and then I basically just save time. You could do those. I want to also say, like, unfortunately for deep learning systems, it's almost always the case that the assumptions about the world that we build into our models come from the way we construct our objective functions and tasks and stimuli ultimately. And like in our case, like basically that sequential comes by design of the stimulus set. Now you can say, how good is that at approximating? Maybe babies usually see like one person in their visual field, in which case like kind of the nature of the training stimulus is like that. Or alternatively, you can say, in reality, much of our life is spent like walking or running through the world, in which case there is not one stationary thing, but it's kind of like a world with flow fields over it, which has a very different like underlying statistical structure, where you might want to attend to self-motion versus attend to others' motion, other people's motions.
That note, can we thank our speaker on something?